Imagine this: you are standing barefoot on the uneven cobblestones of a crowded village square. It's late morning, and the smell in the air is a mix of wood smoke, damp earth, and the tang of livestock. Merchants have abandoned their stalls, farmers have left their fields, and now everyone, from the oldest grandmother to the youngest child, has gathered in a tight ring around you. Your crime? You looked like you might have stolen a loaf of bread. Not proven guilty, merely accused. That's all it takes. The mayor is there in his thick wool cloak, standing next to the priest, who clutches a wooden cross as though your presence alone is an insult to God. Around you, the crowd murmurs, passing judgment long before the sentence is carried out. Somewhere a dog barks, and in the pause that follows a figure emerges, a man in a leather apron, hands blackened from soot, carrying a long iron bar glowing red from the forge. The heat radiates from it in shimmering waves, and the crowd leans forward. The man's voice is calm, almost bored, as he tells you to walk across the square carrying it. The rules are simple. 3 days from now, the village elders will unwrap your hands. If the burns have healed cleanly, you're innocent and free to go. If they're infected or unhealed, well, the next punishment will be worse, and everyone here knows it. This is medieval justice, a system where evidence is optional, trials are brief, and punishments are designed to do more than hurt. They're meant to be remembered. They're not just for you, the accused. They're for the audience. They're to make everyone watching think twice before stepping out of line. In the Middle Ages, justice wasn't a quiet affair behind court doors. It was theatre. The stage was the village square. The actors were the accused and the executioner, and the audience was everyone else. Fear was the glue that held society together, and pain was the ink used to write the rules. If you lived in a small town in the 14th century, there was no newspaper to read about a criminal's fate, no wanted posters, no evening news. There was the bell in the church tower. There was the town crier's voice echoing off the timber-framed houses, and there was the irresistible pull of a public punishment. You didn't just hear about it, you went to see it, to experience it, to carry the image home in your mind. The town crier was the first act in this grim drama. He would march through the muddy lanes, ringing a handbell to draw attention and shout the name of the accused, the crime committed, and, if it was already decided, the punishment to come. He would add flourishes to his speech, little insults or exaggerations to stir the crowd's excitement. By the time you were dragged to the square, your guilt was already assumed. The real show was about to begin, and medieval Europe loved a good show. For the lesser crimes, petty theft, drunkenness, public brawling, gossip, punishments didn't have to spill blood to leave a mark. Sometimes humiliation was considered more effective than pain. The cucking stool was one such invention. Imagine a sturdy wooden chair bolted to the end of a long beam, the sort used to hoist heavy barrels. Now imagine that beam mounted over a pond or river. The accused, perhaps a drunkard, perhaps a woman rumored to have a sharp tongue, would be strapped into the chair and swung out over the water. With a cheer from the crowd, the beam would be dropped, plunging the victim beneath the surface. Up they'd come, gasping and sputtering before being dunked again. The process could go on for minutes or for hours, depending on the mood of the officials and the spectators. You didn't drown, ideally, but you left cold, soaked, humiliated, and with the knowledge that your shame had been witnessed by every soul in town. In other villages there was the shame stool, a rough wooden seat placed in the busiest part of the square. The accused would be tied to it, sometimes with a sign around their neck declaring their crime. Passers-by were encouraged to mock, spit, or throw scraps of food, or less pleasant things. Children learned early that the safest place to misbehave was not in front of the elders, unless they wanted to end up on that stool themselves. Then, of course, there were the stocks and pillory. These weren't inventions of fairy tales. They were as real as the timber and iron they were built from. The stocks held your ankles, forcing you to sit. The pillory held your head and hands, forcing you to stand. Locked in place, you were utterly vulnerable. People might hurl mud, rotten vegetables, fish heads, or worse. Some took the opportunity to settle personal grudges. A day in the stocks could leave you bruised, filthy, and exhausted, and that was if you were lucky enough to avoid more serious injury. We tend to imagine these punishments as mere inconveniences, but in the medieval world, public humiliation was a heavy sentence. In a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, being seen in the stocks or on the stool meant carrying a stain on your reputation for years, maybe for the rest of your life. But for all the pain and embarrassment these punishments caused, they were still considered mild compared to what lay ahead. Because humiliation could take on far stranger forms, costumes, masks, and props turned criminals into walking symbols of their misdeeds. Heavy iron masks shaped like pigs' heads or donkeys were clamped over the face, some with long metal tongues designed to pull at the neck muscles. Others were fitted with bells, so the sound of the offender's shame carried through the streets. Bad musicians might be sentenced to the flute of shame, a metal pipe that locked around the neck with the offender's hands fixed to it, frozen in an eternal mocking performance as they were paraded before the townsfolk. Husbands caught cheating could be forced to wear antlers in public, the original cuckold joke played out in real life, and some offenders were made to wear bright, garish tunics with their crimes sewn onto the fabric in large letters, a punishment you couldn't hide from even after you left the square. Medieval justice loved spectacle. And in these early acts of the performance, the goal wasn't to kill you, it was to make you a living warning, a cautionary tale that could be pointed at, laughed at, and remembered. Because in this world, the worst fate wasn't necessarily death, it was becoming a story the neighbors would tell for decades. Some punishments were meant to humiliate, others were meant to break you, not just in body but in spirit. And when the medieval mind turned toward truth-seeking, it often reached for pain as its most reliable tool. The belief was simple, almost childlike in its logic. A guilty man will lie to save himself, but a guilty man in pain will tell the truth. What they didn't admit, or perhaps didn't care about, was that a man in pain will say anything. And so began the ordeals, those grim tests that blurred the line between punishment and trial. The ordeal of water was perhaps the most infamous. Bound hand and foot, you would be carried to the edge of a river or a deep pond. A priest would bless the water, declaring it pure, incorruptible, a symbol of God's own truth. If you floated, it meant the water rejected you as a sinner. If you sank, you were innocent, though the verdict might come too late to matter. There are records of accused witches proving their innocence by drowning. The law in such cases was satisfied, if not the victim. Others faced the ordeal of hot iron. The accused would take a heavy, glowing bar of metal in their bare hands and carry it a set number of paces, perhaps 3, perhaps 9. The bar would be set down and the wounds carefully bound. 3 days later, the bindings were removed before the village elders. If the skin was healing cleanly, you were declared innocent. If there was infection or the burns looked worse, well, the verdict was guilt, and your suffering had only begun. Medieval medicine had no antiseptics, no real understanding of infection. A cut from a farming tool could end in death, let alone the damage from a molten iron bar. But these trials were not designed to give you a fair chance. They were designed to create a moment for the crowd. The hush as the iron was handed over, the smell of burning flesh, the gasp as you staggered across the square. This was justice as performance. Torture devices were used not only for the guilty, but for the accused. Their confessions wrung from them in the flickering torchlight of a dungeon. The thumbscrew was a simple device, a metal frame that pressed down on the thumb or sometimes the fingers, crushing bone slowly. The victim's screams would echo down stone corridors, mingling with the clink of chains. The rack was more elaborate, more theatrical. You were tied hand and foot, your body stretched on a wooden frame as rollers turned, pulling joints from their sockets. Witnesses reported that it could add inches to a person's height before the body gave out entirely. These methods were often used in private, but word of them traveled quickly. A single survivor, hobbling through town with twisted limbs, served as a walking advertisement for the efficiency of pain. The message was clear: the truth has a price, and in this age, it's paid in agony. Not all punishments were about truth. Many were about creativity, a strangely artistic instinct that took the crime and mirrored it in the sentence. If you had been loud, you might be silenced. If you had cheated in trade, you might be shamed through your own goods. In England and Scotland, the Branks bridle was reserved for scolds, people, often women, accused of speaking too much or too harshly. It was a cage of iron that fit over the head with a flat plate inside that pressed down on the tongue, sometimes with sharp points. It didn't kill you, but after hours or days it could make you wish it had. Merchants caught selling spoiled meat might have it burned under their noses until the smell clung to their clothes and skin. Bakers who shorted customers on bread might be paraded through the streets with loaves strung around their necks, a walking billboard for their own dishonesty. Fraudulent traders were tied to their own stalls for a full market day, forced to face the very customers they had cheated. Some punishments were mobile, moving through the streets like grim parades. Whipping carts dragged the condemned through town, their backs bared to the lash as onlookers jeered. The journey was as much the point as the beating itself, a way to ensure that no quarter of the town was denied its share of the spectacle. But these were still survivable, others were not. Execution in medieval Europe was never just a matter of ending a life. It was about sending a message, crafting a final image that would burn itself into the minds of all who watched. The breaking wheel was a favorite for crimes deemed especially vile. The condemned would be tied to a massive wooden wheel, arms and legs spread wide. Then came the iron cudgel, swinging down to shatter bone, sometimes in a prescribed order. First the legs, then the arms, working inward until the victim could no longer move. The broken limbs might be threaded between the spokes, twisting the body into grotesque shapes. Death could take hours, even days, if the executioner was skilled or cruel. Impalement was rarer, but its reputation traveled far. A sharpened stake would be set into the ground, and the victim lowered onto it, sometimes carefully to avoid immediate death. The stake might pierce the body and emerge through the shoulder, the chest, even the mouth. Gravity would do the rest, inch by inch, while the crowd watched in horrified fascination. Those who survived for hours were considered almost superhuman, and then they died. Boiling alive was used for certain crimes. Counterfeiting coins, poisoning, even occasional political executions. The victim would be placed into a large cauldron, the liquid heated beneath them. In some cases they were lowered into boiling water or oil already at temperature. In others, the heat was applied gradually, prolonging the ordeal. The hiss of flesh meeting hot liquid was a sound that few could forget. And then there was the coffin torture. An iron cage shaped like the human body, just large enough to hold the victim upright. It was hung in a public place, sometimes with the prisoner still alive, sometimes with their corpse inside. Insects, birds, and the elements would do their work until only bones remained. The cage might hang for weeks as a warning to all who passed. Not even the powerful were immune, though their punishments had a different flavor. A disgraced noble might be confined to one wing of his castle, the luxury of his surroundings a bitter reminder of the freedom he'd lost. Kings and princes captured in war might be paraded in chains through the streets of their enemy's capital, stripped of their crowns and made to ride on mules, the least dignified of mounts. In such moments, the humiliation was the point, a political theatre meant to display the victor's dominance. Yet the system could miscalculate. Sometimes the crowd did not side with the executioner. A thief who stole bread to feed the hungry might draw cheers instead of insults. Rotten vegetables, meant for the criminal, might find their way toward the guards. In rare cases, mobs broke prisoners out of the stocks or pillory, defying the authorities in plain sight. Public punishment was meant to unite the community against the guilty, but sometimes it united them against the law itself. The legacy of these punishments lingers. We no longer dunk gossips in ponds or parade adulterers with horns, but public shaming has simply moved to new stages. Viral videos, social media call-outs, mugshots shared online. The tools have changed, but the impulse remains the same. We still gather to witness the downfall of others. We still take satisfaction, however grim, in the spectacle of justice. And so, when we look back at the Middle Ages with horror at the breaking wheel, the iron mask, the boiling cauldron, perhaps we should also look in the mirror. The punishments may be gone, but the audience is very much the same. Because in medieval Europe, you didn't just pay for your crimes. You performed them, and the crowd never forgot the show. And when the crowd drifted home, leaving the square littered with trampled straw and broken bits of vegetable, the story of your disgrace didn't vanish with them. It seeped into the tavern that evening, into the whispers traded across ale-stained tables, into the cautious glances from neighbors the next morning. The square might fall quiet, but the punishment lived on in the mouths of those who had seen it. Children reenacted it in play, using sticks for cudgels and imagining the sting of the lash. Old men recalled it years later, embellishing the details until the event became half truth, half legend. This was how medieval justice endured, in the telling as much as in the doing. Some punishments were never meant for the crowd alone. They were meant for the accused to carry like a second skin. Branding was one such sentence, the hot iron pressed to flesh until a permanent symbol burned its way into the muscle beneath. The mark might be a letter, a cross, or the crest of a local lord, depending on the crime. In England, a thief might bear a T, a vagrant a V. In parts of France, blasphemers carried the fleur-de-lis on their shoulder, a reminder to all who saw them that their tongue had once offended God and king alike. These were punishments that walked with you into every market and every church for the rest of your life. Travel a little east to the German states, and you might find a merchant accused of cheating customers dragged before his own stall. There he would be tied in place while the cheated goods, a short-weight scale, a barrel of watered-down wine, were displayed beside him. Customers were encouraged to jeer, spit, or even strike him. The day would pass slowly under the heat of the sun or the bite of the wind, each hour turning shame into something heavier, more permanent. But not all disgrace wore iron or ink. In Florence, a tailor who misrepresented his cloth might be forced to walk the streets wearing a robe made from his own shoddy fabric, stitched crudely so the seams strained and the colors clashed. The point was not just to punish the man, it was to make him an object of ridicule so visible that laughter itself became a weapon. There were seasons to punishment too. In many towns, the most severe sentences were timed for feast days or market days when outsiders flooded the streets and the potential audience swelled. A hanging on a festival day was not a disruption, it was an addition to the entertainment. Vendors sold spiced wine and meat pies while the condemned waited in the cold. Jugglers and minstrels played between proclamations from the town crier. The line between celebration and execution blurred until the crowd's cheer for a tumbling acrobat flowed seamlessly into the cheer for a clean stroke of the executioner's sword. In Paris, under the shadow of Notre Dame, executions were often held on holy days. The clergy argued that the public display of justice reminded the faithful of divine law, though one suspects the size of the crowd played no small part. A good executioner knew to work with the rhythm of the day, to let silence bloom before the final act, to give the audience time to lean forward, to breathe as one. Not every punishment was fixed to the square. Some moved through the streets like grim processions. In Bruges, a woman accused of adultery might be paraded barefoot from her home to the city gates, wearing a shift no thicker than a bedsheet, even in winter, a rope around her neck. At each major crossing, the procession paused while a herald announced her name and crime. Her shame became the city's property, shared and witnessed in every quarter. In Ghent, thieves were sometimes whipped from one end of the city to the other, their backs striped red before they were driven out beyond the walls. And then there were punishments that blurred the line between law and revenge. In the port towns of the Mediterranean, sailors caught deserting their ships could be keel-hauled, dragged beneath the hull, their skin raked by barnacles until it came away in strips. Though this was more a naval discipline than a civic one, tales of such punishments traveled far inland, told with a mix of horror and awe in smoky taverns, where men boasted of things they had never seen. The cruelty of the age was not always blunt, sometimes it was meticulous. The executioners of Nuremberg were known for their precision in the breaking wheel, striking first at the shins, then the forearms, then the thighs, always working inward so that life clung stubbornly to the body even as the body betrayed itself. In the far north, among the towns of Norway and Sweden, the axe was preferred, but even here the act could be prolonged. A condemned man might be forced to watch his own sword, the one he had once worn with pride, hammered into the blade that would take his head. It is tempting to think of these punishments as born from an age that knew no better, but that would be too simple. The spectacle was deliberate. It was not ignorance, it was strategy. A town that had seen its baker whipped for cheating waits would think twice before haggling too hard at the next market. A village that had watched a gossip's head forced into the brank would measure its words more carefully. Even so, the crowd was never a passive thing. On rare occasions, sympathy could swell like a tide and turn against the officials. In the town of Limerick, a boy of 14 was sentenced to the stocks for stealing a loaf from the baker's window. As the hours passed, the people brought him not mockery but food, crusts, apples, even a wedge of cheese. By evening, the baker's own apprentice slipped the lock and the boy vanished into the alleys before the guard returned. For weeks afterward, the officials muttered about troublemakers, but no one was punished. Still, such moments were rare. More often the crowd came for what it had been promised, a shared experience, a little thrill of danger from a safe distance, the satisfaction of seeing order restored through the pain of another. As the centuries turned, some punishments fell away, their places taken by fines, imprisonment, and more discreet forms of justice. Yet others lingered in pockets of Europe, stubborn traditions outlasting the kings who had ordered them. In rural Russia, the knout, a long heavy whip, was used into the 19th century, its strokes capable of cutting to the bone. In the Scottish Highlands, tarring and feathering was employed not only as punishment but as warning. The blackened figure sent staggering home to be seen by all, and in every age there were those who profited from the spectacle. Alehouses near execution grounds did brisk business, and some innkeepers paid bribes to have the gallows moved closer to their door. Ballads were written about notorious criminals sold in the streets on cheap broadsheets before the bodies were cold. Children played at being judge and executioner, their games echoing the real cries they had heard in the square. If you were unlucky enough to stand in that square on the day your fate was decided, you might find your last comfort in the rhythm of the world continuing around you, the clink of a blacksmith's hammer in the distance, the rustle of wind in the eaves, the soft cooing of pigeons indifferent to your plight. The square had seen it all before and would see it again, and perhaps in that final moment, as the rope tightened, as the iron burned, as the water closed over your head, you would understand the truth of medieval justice. It was never just about you. It was about them, the crowd, the memory, the story that would be told long after you were gone. Because here, in this world, punishment was not an end. It was the seed of a tale, and the telling would last far longer than the pain. And when your name passed into the mouths of strangers, shaped and reshaped with each retelling, the crowd would gather again, if not in the square, then in their minds, to watch you perform your crime, your penance, your death. The stage would be ready, the audience would be waiting, and the show, in some form or another, would never end. There was the case of Martha of Leuven, whose name would live in the mouths of townsfolk for a generation. She was the widow of a tanner, a woman whose voice could be heard above the market din, whose laughter sometimes carried too far into the night. One spring, after an argument with the bailiff's wife, a rumor spread that Martha had cursed her neighbor's cow and soured its milk. It mattered little that the cow had been sickly since winter. The story had taken root. On the morning of St. George's feast, Martha was fetched from her door by 2 constables and led barefoot through the square to the pond where the cucking stool waited. The crowd was already thick, the air damp with mist. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. The first dunk sent her under in a roar of water and laughter, her skirts ballooning like a drowning bell. She came up gasping, hair plastered to her cheeks, eyes bright with fury. Each plunge grew colder and her arms trembled against the ropes, but her glare never wavered. Long after she was cut loose, shivering and blue-lipped, that glare became part of the story, told by some as defiance, by others as proof of guilt. For years afterward, mothers would lean to their children and whisper, "Mind your tongue, or you'll end up like Martha." Not all tales were of defiance. In the walled city of Carcassonne there was a mason named Jourdain who took pride in his craft, but drank away much of his pay. One night, after too much wine, he brawled with another man in the street and left him bloodied. The man lived, but the city guard made an example of Jourdain. At sunrise he was locked in the pillory in front of the very gate he had helped repair the year before. The sun climbed higher, and with it the smell of his own sweat mingled with the stench of rotting vegetables hurled by passers-by. The worst came not from the strangers, but from his fellow masons, who jeered in the language of their trade, calling him a crack in the wall, a flaw in the stone. By nightfall his head drooped forward, and when they released him he walked away with shoulders bent, as if a new weight had been built into his very frame. For Jourdain, the real sentence was not the day in the pillory, but the way the city's eyes followed him afterward, measuring the man against the wall and finding both untrue. Further north, in the port town of Lübeck, the punishment was more theatrical still. A young sailor named Eric was accused of deserting his ship after a quarrel with the captain. Desertion was a serious matter, a threat to trade, to discipline, to the image of the port itself. The sentence was public whipping along the quay, but the harbour master added a flourish. Eric was lashed not only by the appointed whipman, but by 3 men from his own crew, each taking turns, their blows cracking in the salt air. The gulls wheeled overhead, screaming in time with each strike. Merchants paused their bargaining to watch, and the smell of pitch from the shipyard mingled with the copper tang of blood. When it was done, Eric was not returned to his ship, but driven out through the city gate, a sack of bread and dried fish thrown at his feet, as if to say, "You may live, but not here." For years afterward, sailors told his story when a green hand spoke of leaving port without leave. Some punishments grew out of the crimes themselves, grotesque mirrors meant to throw the offence back into the face of the offender. In a market town in Burgundy, a butcher was caught selling meat from an animal that had died of sickness. The sentence came swiftly. He was tied to a post in the square, and the same rancid meat was hung around his neck until the stench clung to his skin and clothes. The sun beat down and flies swarmed so thick he could not open his mouth without tasting them. Children dared each other to run close and wave their hands before retreating in giggles, their noses wrinkled. The butcher's shop never opened again, and for years any spoiled smell in the market was met with the muttered phrase, "the butcher's perfume." In some towns the punishment travelled instead of the condemned. In Edinburgh, a woman named Agnes, convicted of petty theft, was fastened to the tail of a cart and dragged through the high street. At each crossing the crier shouted her crime while she was whipped, the lashes raising welts across her shoulders. The sound of the whip was sharp and quick, but the crowd's reaction varied. Some spat, some looked away, and a few, mostly women, stood silent with their lips pressed thin. By the time she reached the city's far gate, her hair was matted with blood, her eyes glassy with exhaustion. She was cut loose and sent beyond the walls, left to walk barefoot into the countryside with nothing but the clothes on her back. Her name was rarely spoken after, but in quiet moments certain market women remembered and set aside a crust for the next stranger who looked too thin. And there were the executions that lived in memory long after the last breath. In 1472, in the German city of Mainz, a man named Conrad was condemned to the breaking wheel for murdering a merchant on the road. On the morning of the sentence, the square filled early. The stalls of the market shoved to the edges to make space. The wheel lay on its side, its wooden spokes gleaming with fresh oil. Conrad was brought forward in chains, his shirt stripped away so the purple lines of old scars caught the light. The executioner began at the shins, the iron cudgel falling with a sound like green wood splitting. The crowd flinched, then leaned in. Each strike was measured, the bones breaking but the life preserved. When the arms were shattered, the executioner threaded them through the spokes, twisting them until they hung like ribbons of flesh. The sun sank lower as Conrad's breathing grew ragged. Some swore he lived until the moon rose, though whether that was truth or the embroidery of memory is impossible to know. What is certain is that for months afterward, children in Mainz played a game called the wheel, chasing one another in circles until someone was caught and pretended to fall, limbs twisted at odd angles. These stories, carried from mouth to mouth, worked as well as any written law. They warned without ink, judged without trial, and endured without parchment. The punishments themselves were finite, an hour in the stocks, a morning on the wheel, but their echoes were endless. A whispered name, a mocking gesture, a half-sung rhyme could reawaken the shame or fear years later. The instruments of pain have long since been dismantled, the wheels rotted, the pillories burned for firewood. But the audience remains, changed only in its stage and tools. Where once we crowded into the square, we now gather behind screens. Where once the town crier's voice carried the news, we have the click of keys, the chime of a notification. The faces in the crowd lean forward all the same, eager to see the fall, quick to pass the story on. The square has no walls now, no edges, but it is still with us. And so is the show. If you walked the streets of a town on the morning of a punishment day, you would sense it before you saw it. The air carried a certain tension, as if the cobblestones themselves were holding their breath. Doors opened earlier, shutters creaked wide, and conversations were quieter at first. Not out of politeness, but because everyone wanted to hear the first bell. That bell would come from the church tower or the town hall, a deep bronze voice cutting through the morning fog. Then came the murmurs, swelling like water in a narrow channel, growing louder as the crowd converged on the place where the day's act would be performed. In the Flemish town of Mechelen, a cloth merchant named Willem was once sentenced to the shame bench for selling imported linen as local work. It was the spring market, and merchants from across the region were in town, their carts heavy with goods. The bench stood in the middle of the square, angled so that the accused sat facing the main thoroughfare. Willem was dressed in his own fine linen, but it had been crudely stitched into a tunic that hung wrong on the shoulders and itched at the neck. Around his neck hung a placard painted with bold letters, "False Merchant." Every trader who passed him that day measured him with their eyes, some with contempt, others with the thin smile of a competitor made richer by his fall. By afternoon the sun had warmed the air enough that sweat darkened the cloth beneath his arms, staining the very linen he had once claimed as the best in Flanders. Sometimes the punishment became a kind of travelling theatre. In the Italian city of Bologna, a thief named Matteo was condemned to the whip and cart. He was bound at the wrists to the cart's frame, shirtless so that the lashes would find bare skin. The cart moved slowly through the winding streets, each turn bringing him into a new piazza where the crier announced his name and crime. Between announcements came the whip, a sound like tearing parchment followed by a hiss of breath through clenched teeth. The smell of baking bread from a nearby oven mingled with the tang of fresh blood. Children darted between the cart's wheels to get a closer look until their mothers pulled them back. The cart wound its way through the city for hours, the sound of hooves and wheels on stone punctuating each corner with the sting of leather. In some places the punishment was timed to the rhythm of the market itself. In York, England, executions and humiliations often took place on market day, when farmers and traders filled the streets. The condemned would be placed in the stocks at first light, just as the first carts rolled in. Throughout the morning buyers passed with baskets and sacks, pausing to glance at the figure trapped in wood and iron. Some offered insults as they haggled for turnips, others simply stared before moving on. The condemned could smell the meat pies and roasted chestnuts from nearby stalls, but could not so much as scratch an itch without awkward contortions. By dusk, when the last of the market goods had been sold and the square was littered with straw, the stocks would be unlocked, not out of mercy, but because the audience had gone home. In the fortified city of Avignon there lived a midwife named Beatrice, who was accused of malpractice when a newborn died in her care. Though no law proved her guilty, the whispers were enough to bring her before the magistrates. They sentenced her to the iron mask, a grotesque thing shaped like the head of a sow with slits for the eyes and a snout that made breathing shallow and hot. She was made to walk the length of the Rue des Teinturiers, from the city gates to the bridge, bells sewn into the hem of her dress so that each step announced her coming. The children of the dyers' families followed her in a growing crowd, ringing their own little bells in mockery. By the time she reached the far end of the street, the skin beneath the mask was slick with sweat and the smell of heated metal clung to her. The mask was removed, but the sound of bells would never again be a neutral thing to her. There were days when the punishments were part of something even larger, the festivals that marked the turning of the year. In Prague, executions were sometimes staged during the carnival, when masks and music already filled the streets. The condemned would be dressed in motley, their crimes shouted from balconies by men in jesters' caps. The laughter of the crowd was a dangerous thing because it was never entirely clear where the jest ended and the cruelty began. On one such day, a man convicted of fraud in the wine trade was forced to drink cup after cup of sour vinegar in the square, each swallow followed by a cheer as though it were part of a game. The vinegar dribbled down his chin and stained the motley in dark blotches that the crowd said looked like the spilled wine he had once cheated them of. In the fishing town of Galway on Ireland's western coast, there was a case spoken of for decades. A young woman named Bridget accused of spreading slander about the mayor's wife. She was sentenced to the Branks bridle. The iron frame enclosed her head, the flat plate inside pressing her tongue down so she could barely swallow. She was led through the streets, the salt wind whipping her hair into the metal. The fishing boats rocked in the harbour behind her, their sails rattling like dry leaves. Men unloading their catch paused to watch. the smell of the day's fish mingling with the faint rust of the iron. At the end of the walk, the bridle was removed, but her tongue bore the imprint of the plate for hours afterward, a private wound to match the public one. Some punishments became communal rituals in themselves. In the mountain villages of Switzerland, petty thieves were sometimes tied to the whipping post in the churchyard on Sunday after Mass. The congregation would file out past them, each person given the chance to speak a word of rebuke or spit on the ground at their feet. One winter morning, a shepherd boy of no more than 12 was caught with a stolen loaf tucked under his cloak. He stood barefoot in the snow, the cold turning his toes white while the villagers passed. The priest was the last to leave. He placed the boy's loaf on the post in front of him, then walked away without a word. The boy ate it in small bites as the wind blew the snow into drifts around his legs. Some said it was mercy, others said it was a lesson, but all agreed they had been there to see it. And there were punishments that blurred into execution without announcement. In the port of Marseille, counterfeiters were sometimes boiled alive in great iron cauldrons set up at the edge of the quay. The sentence was public, the place chosen so that ships from other ports would carry the story home. The hiss of the water was joined by the shouts of vendors selling bread and olives nearby. The smell was unforgettable. Those who saw it found themselves recalling it years later at the sight of steam rising from a pot, and the tale traveled farther than the men who told it ever would. The weight of these stories was not in the punishments themselves, but in the way they were carried forward, embroidered and reshaped, folded into the life of the town, until the event became as much a part of the place as its walls or its well. A child who had seen a thief whipped might tell the story to his own children, adding flourishes of blood or bravery that made the lesson sharper. A woman who had thrown a rotten apple at the stocks might recall it fondly in old age as a moment when justice was done. And so, like the echo in a narrow street, the punishment repeated itself long after the act. The Middle Ages ended, but the appetite for the show did not. The square has moved, the actors have changed, but the crowd still gathers, eager for the sight of someone brought low. The instruments may no longer be wood and iron, the stage may no longer be cobblestone, yet the audience is eternal, and as long as it waits there will be those ready to play their part, whether they wish to or not.